Good evening, and thank you all for the invite to come and talk to you a little bit tonight about our land use planning in the city of Bellingham, as well as some of our building regulations and how they relate to the Climate Action Plan. I think it's important to kind of start to give you a background as to planning rules and regulations first, so that you get an understanding a little bit about it. So we're going to kind of start at a higher level and maybe work our way down a little bit through some things. So the first thing to know about planning in the state of Washington is that we operate under the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act was a state plan, it was a state 1990 mandate to plan for 20 years of growth. It requires us to look at both population growth as well as job growth. So I wanted to make sure that cities and counties had enough places to grow for people and for them to work. The Growth Management Act really looks at creating a county-wide framework. So we work with the county as well as all the other local jurisdictions to create these 20-year plans. Part of the process is establishing an urban growth area, and the county actually leads that. So we do population projections and look at how much land we will potentially need, and the county actually helps us refine that and then adopts those areas. You might ask why? Why did we have the Growth Management Act? Well, the main reason was because of the benefits of long-range regional planning. We know that it reduces costs and it sets clear expectations for growth. The Growth Management Act contains 14 goals that kind of illustrate what communities have to evaluate when they're looking at their plans. Then when it gets down to the local level, we have a comprehensive plan. And the Bellingham Comprehensive Plan is the city's vision for our growth. What do we want our community to look like in 20 years? How do we want to grow? And how are we going to get there? Beyond the comprehensive plan, we have to adopt rules and regulations. Those are actually the building blocks of the Comprehensive Plan and the Growth Management Act. They all work hand in hand. So you've got this hierarchy of growth management that says what you need to look at. The Comprehensive Plan gets down to the local details of it, and then your development regulations implement your Comprehensive Plan. And to make sure that we have our plan is dealing with growth in the appropriate ways, and our vision remains the same. We have to update those every 8 years. So I mentioned the 14 goals there. There are 14 goals here. They range from making sure that we've got urban growth where it is, where the facilities are, so concentrate those urban growth areas in the cities, help reduce sprawl by protecting the rural areas as well, and our ag lands. We also know that sprawl it's expensive to provide services for. It includes transportation. We want to make sure that it's efficient and multimodal. We also need to make sure that we're encouraging a variety of affordable housing options through our housing chapters. Economic development, make sure that we have the appropriate lands available to grow for job growth. Property rights is also an important thing to make sure that there's no arbitrary decisions and to protect those property rights. Also, permits. You want to make sure that we're permitting in a fair manner and in a timely manner. We've also got natural resource industries to make sure that we plan for natural resources and industries. Everything from logging to mining in our communities. Also, open space and recreation, that's always a really important thing. Protecting and enhancing the environment. Always want to make sure that we're engaging our citizenry and making sure that they're involved in creating our visioning process. Then also making sure that we've got the proper public facilities and services and adequate facilities to service this population growth. We recognize the historic preservation is important, and we want to make sure that we're preserving historic sites. And then also the 14th goal was a goal that was added later on, and that one was to want to make sure that we were keeping shoreline management in context as well, and the Shoreline Management Act goals and policies are adopted as part of the the 14th goal of the Growth Management Act. One of the key things about these goals is that the Growth Management Act requires us to take a balanced approach. It says specifically make sure that your environment is not more important than your housing needs. Your open space and recreation is not more important than your permitting. We need to look at these as from a balanced perspective, and not one of them holds priority over the others. So once we get kind of that framework, then what do we do as a local jurisdiction? Again, we're creating our vision here, and these 8 elements are essentially chapters of our comprehensive plan. We have a land use chapter that talks about how and where we want to grow and what our zoning should look like. We've got a community design chapter that talks about what we want it to look like, different forms and stuff. Our housing chapter makes sure that we're providing for affordability, and we are encouraging alternative housing forms. Obviously, you're going to hear a little bit more tonight about the multimodal transportation element in there. We've also got an economic development chapter, an environment chapter, the parks and recreation, open space, and then our capital and facilities and utilities. You can see up in this diagram kind of how we started. When we create our plan, what we do is we look at obviously the Growth Management Act, the goals. We look at our county-wide planning policies. Those are the policies that are adopted at the county level. With the City of Bellingham, the council has also adopted our legacies and strategic commitments, so we want to make sure that we're evaluating those as we're creating our plan. And then again, back to that community participation, making sure that we understand the community preferences and we're getting essential data to inform that. All of that together creates the comprehensive plan. Then the most important part that we need to do with our plan, we don't want it to sit on the shelf, we want to implement it. It's really important. And how do we do that? Well, we've got sub-area plans that we do that by. These are some of our neighborhood plans. We've got 25 different neighborhoods in the city, and each of those neighborhoods have their own specific neighborhood plan. We've also got city programs that are going on. We've got our environmental regulations that are going on, our capital facility improvements, and of course our development regulations, because again, those development regulations are really the implementing tool here. So what does our comprehensive plan say about our growth strategy? The city's primary growth strategy is to accommodate future growth and development through a system of compact, walkable urban villages. So the city has designated 7 different urban villages in our community. And what these districts are is they are compact, they're walkable, they're high density, lots of activities that are going on, and they are the places that we can live and work. One of the key components about this is it reduces the dependency on the auto. If I can walk to work, or if I can walk to the store to get whatever I need, that's one less trip that I may have to get into my vehicle. These urban villages, they make up about 3.8% of our land area, but in our comprehensive plan, they're actually expected to accommodate about 30% of our anticipated annual growth. 9% of all housing units are actually located in the urban villages right now, and that equates to about 7% of the city's population. Since 2006, when we first adopted the urban village concept, we've had about 38% of all new housing units built in the urban villages. And what's really exciting is that we actually have about 20 projects with about 1,200 and more units that are in the plans right now. So either they're going through land use permitting, or they're in some pre-application process, or they're under construction right now. So what does all that mean? It means that our plans are working. I mean, this is the most exciting thing I think about this, is that we've actually done a good job of projecting what our future is going to be, how we should accommodate it. We set the rules and the regulations that set the urban villages up, and guess what we're seeing? We're actually seeing development in the urban villages, and so this is great news. Also in our comprehensive plan, each of those sections that I talked about earlier all have goals and policies associated with them. I've taken out just kind of this is a section on the land use goals that I believe are important to climate change and what the task force should be probably evaluating. Again, we've got a broad range of goals here that talk about foster and urban villages. Again, we're seeing that being successful. We want to make sure that we're protecting and restoring our natural resources through proactive environmental stewardship. One of the great things is encouraging live-work units and promoting small-scale commercial uses within neighborhoods. Again, less auto-dependency, the availability for people to walk to the store versus having to get into their automobile and drive to go to the store. Again, some of our land use policies talk about focusing intense land use, so those higher densities in our urban villages, but also on transit corridors, another multimodal opportunity here. We've got policies that talk about promoting green building and also reviewing our parking standards. Let's not dictate so much about around the car and the auto. Let's think about something different besides that. These are out of our environment chapter. Again, limiting that urban sprawl, so making sure that we're creating these dense, compact cities, maintaining our natural resources, including the urban forest. Obviously, we want to reduce our contributions to climate change. One of the ways of achieving that goal is by creating an urban forestry management plan. That's actually on our work program this year to do for. We also want to promote the knowledge of trees and tree care. And one of the key things that we talk about in the development community is the right tree in the right place. Many times we've got trees that are growing that are not the appropriate place for an urban area. So when we do urban development, we want to make sure that we've got that right tree located in that right place for it. And then obviously consider the role of trees. And then we've got a whole slew of policies that deal specifically with climate change. One of the key things about of our goals and policies. Remember, if we go back to the Growth Management Act, I talked a little bit about balance. We've got goals and policies in our comprehensive plan that may seem to be contradictory to each other. For example, we talk about the urban forestry manager and keeping or management plan and keeping trees and maintaining our natural resources. But we also say limit urban sprawl. So how do you do those things? We've got undeveloped land that right now acts as great buffers and wildlife corridors. But we know that they're important, but we also know that managing growth and not letting it sprawl is important as well. So again, we have to balance all of these goals and policies in our comprehensive plan through our development regulations. Some of the development regulations that I think are very applicable to the task force group is, again, just our zoning and our rules and regulations in our urban villages, making sure that we've got those compact places for people to live and work. Also, alternative housing forms. Right now, Bellingham is pretty unique in the manner that it has really detached single-family development and walk-up apartment buildings. You may have heard the term the missing middle. We don't have a lot of other housing forms in Bellingham at this point. And those are important because many of those alternative housing forms take up less land to develop on. Our infill toolkit is one of those ways. We've got cottage development, townhouse development, duplex development. Those are all alternative housing forms, triplexes that maybe we could see more of in our community that would help with our footprint on the landscape. We've also got rules and regulations that deal with a green factor, and a green factor actually specifically says how much vegetation needs to be on a piece of property. So we have to ensure that we're even though we are developing, we're keeping it green and vegetated and natural. We understand the benefits associated with that, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a social, mental, physical perspective as well. Obviously, we promote low-impact development, one as part of our stormwater rules and regulations, but also as part of our land use regulations. In our clearing and grading chapter, we also talk about maintaining and replacing trees. Again, that right tree for that right place concept. We've got reduced parking standards in some of our areas as well. So in our urban villages, we've realized that Maybe you don't need to have an automobile when you've got all of the services and your work opportunities nearby. So in these urban villages, we've reduced the parking requirements. But we also know that times are changing. Not everyone has a car. So we wanted to make sure that people have the opportunity to apply for parking waivers. And I think why this is important, because our parkings have minimums right now. We've got minimum parking requirements for each type of development you have to provide parking for. But if you can show that maybe you've got a different situation, one of the things that we have found is maybe some of our elder housing. They don't need the same amount of cars that somebody else may use. And so having those parking minimums set, but also allowing for those parking waivers is a great way to be flexible depending on the type of development that's going in. One of the newer things that we just adopted last year was our subdivision code. This, I think, is going to be a great change. It's really going to help us realize the density in our that's already established. It allows for efficient use of land. It also reduces grading and clearing where feasible. This is kind of a new concept that we're looking at, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the low impact development requirements. But essentially this new code tells us to look at the land first. So what's out there first? Before you come in and start plopping houses and lots and streets and stormwater ponds and sewer mains and things like that, why don't you look at what the land's there first? So if we know we've got a great clump of trees in this area and we've got some slopes in this area, well then let's look at those there and kind of keep them there, and then see how we can fit the development in between that. And so we're not doing mass clearing. Unfortunately, that is a pretty standard practice in our jurisdiction and in many other jurisdictions, is that some builders believe that it's easier just to scrape the land and start from fresh. They can go back in and replant trees. We think, yeah, we understand that, but we also believe that you can do that through design as well. And so we've created the flexibility in the subdivision code that allows for maybe a smaller lot in certain places, as long as you're maintaining that overall density. One of the other things that our subdivision code talks about is the clustering of development. So if you're preserving this hillside, then maybe more intense development in a corner of the lot. So that one, the City Council just adopted that late last year, so we're really excited to get some new projects involved in through that process. As I mentioned also, we'll be looking at an urban forestry management plan this year. Our codes also include incentives. Many of these incentives are in our urban villages. Why? Because that's where we want the growth to occur. Everything from green building to density bonuses, floor area ratio increases for certain things. The floor area ratio is how big and how tall building is on the lot. We've also got tax breaks that are incorporated into that. And then we're also actively following quite a few 2019 legislative bills that are supporting housing options. I just got the 1 minute sign. Holy Toledo, I'm going to have to go fast. Sorry about that. So that was kind of the land use. Now we're going to get into the building regulations and energy codes. The Energy Conservation and Production Act was adopted at the federal level, and that requires states to meet minimum energy standards. Basically, it creates the International Energy Conservation Code, which is a national model energy code. It sets standards for both commercial and residential buildings. And 2018 actually marks the 20th anniversary of the IECC. The energy codes are on a 3-year cycle, and surprisingly, 8 states actually have no energy codes. You can see these are the commercial buildings. The green, this is from no energy code all the way up to really, really good energy code. And this is really important, I think, for folks to understand, is that Washington is a bright green in both the residential and the commercial. And what that says is that our energy codes for Washington State exceed the bare minimums that the federal level assert. They are very progressive, and they're quite efficient. As I mentioned, we exceed the federal standards. We're one of the top 10 states for energy policy from the American Council of Energy for an Energy Efficient Economy. The original Washington State Energy Code was adopted in 1990. Those are, again, on a 3-year cycle, so every 3 years we evaluate those codes, or the state evaluates those codes through the State Building Code Council. Right now, we've got 2018 codes under review. The commercial codes have essentially been done and are out there waiting for the State Building Code Council to review. Part of that review process includes proposed amendments that come forward, and then there's technical advisory groups that evaluate those proposed amendments, and then there's public hearings on it. So essentially we're reviewing these 2018 amendments for a November 15th, 2019 final council decision on those, and the local jurisdictions would then adopt and implement those in July 1st of 2020. One of the, again, I talked a lot about the Washington State Energy Efficient, the Energy Code, how progressive it is, and what a high standard it already is. Our codes already require increasingly energy efficient homes and buildings. One of the interesting things about this is that the energy codes require a 70% reduction of the 2006 energy code. So those original codes that were established in 2006, we have to have a 70% reduction by 2031. And each cycle, we have to increase our energy efficiency. And as you can see, that's what we're looking at right here. You've got these target rates, which are 8.75% of savings compared to the 2006 energy code, as well as a 14% savings compared to each previous cycle. So in 2015, we adopted a code. 2018 codes need to have a 14% more increased savings associated with energy efficiency for these codes. One of the key components also is that Governor Inslee issued an executive order that said, well, we've got these 2031 guidelines out there, but what can we do to go even faster and be more aggressive and try to achieve this early and widespread deployment? And also one of the key components of the energy codes is that we have to evaluate the cost benefit of the changes and making sure that we're doing that net savings over a 50-year life cycle of building. One of the things that has been discussed at both a local level and a state level is that these goals they're pretty high when you start to look about it, start to think about it. And whether or not we can actually achieve it will be something that's going to need to be discussed. Essentially, what you normally do with trying to make improvements is you try to tackle the low-hanging fruit. Well, we've tackled all of those low-hanging fruit when it comes to energy codes, and the next fruit are pretty big ones. And what does that mean? That means they're most likely going to be pretty costly. And we need to make sure that those costs are evaluated as well. And one of the things that has been discussed is, well, you've got this 50-year life cycle of building components, the mechanical systems that are included in that. Well, if you go out and buy a furnace, you're not buying a furnace that's guaranteed to last 50 years. I mean, so you need to make sure the cost benefit really being analyzed appropriately? Does it need to be something different? Because the equipment, it just doesn't last that long. One of the interesting things about the Washington State Energy Code is that there are maximums and minimums. That means the maximum code means we can't go above that code unless it's adopted by the state. That's really important because local jurisdictions have the ability to adopt the codes, but the Washington State Legislature or the State Building Code Council has to ensure that that we do it appropriately. And again, these are these maximums, and we can't go above and beyond what the State Building Code Council has already adopted. So we really need to work at that higher level, that state level, to get that changed. So that we can do something local. I hear a lot of people ask about the International Green Construction Code. The one thing about this is the most recent version was just released. It was originally a 2012 collaboration between the International Code Council and several other agencies, American Institute of Architects as well. And what the International Green Construction Code was is an overlay code, and essentially is a coordinated building code between the International Energy Conservation Code, that's that federal mandate up there, and the building code. So how do they mesh? It's very similar to, they've got requirements that are very similar to LEED building, if you've ever heard of that. What we found was that Washington State Energy Code is actually more rigorous. It provides a higher requirement than these federal rules or international rules. And again, our initial review by the TAG indicated that it should be voluntary, and let's revisit it later on. So what do we do right now? We've got expedited permit review in both our land use. So if you've got a development proposal that comes in to the urban villages, we're making sure that those get bumped up to the head of the line when it comes to processing our land use permits, as well as building permit. We've got what's known as the bin bump up. So if you do a green building project, we've got designated timeframes for review, a 7-day turnaround on a building permit, a 28-day time on a building permit, and then a 56-day turnaround time on a building permit. So most of the buildings that are coming in are probably like a 28-day. Well, if you go through a green building process, you actually get bumped up to that next bin, and we'll do it in a 7-day turnaround period. Again, we do advanced materials and methods. This is a section that's allowed in the state building or in the international building codes that allow you to supplement. So you've got these basic parameters of how you do development or how you do construction. But if you can show through this advanced materials and methods that the same level of quality can be achieved, then you can do that. Some of the things that we have already approved policies for as the roof-mounted PV panels. Bellingham was actually the first in the state, and now some of you heard about all the gains last week for the PV installations, and Bellingham was actually the first one in the state to create this quick turnaround on building permits and no longer require engineering for installation on single-family homes. So that savings was actually realized at the state level, and our state codes now adopted emergency codes that allow everyone to implement something that Bellingham did first. We also have, sorry, there's a ton of bills that are out there right now. This is really neat. We've got some great neat metering. Additional, remember I talked about the maximums of our energy code. There's some bills here that will allow that to go away. Minimum densities, increasing building capacity. The key takeaways that I'd like to relay is just we need to continue to implement our comprehensive plan. There's some really great stuff in there. We're obviously seeing it with our urban village plans, and as long as we can continue to do that, that's great. I also really encourage the public participation in the code development process. Many times when we take these complicated and hard pressing rules forward, we really need to, our decision makers need to make sure that they've got support in making those. So as much participation is important when that happens. And you have to watch out for the unintended consequences. We can go ahead and make it require more efficient building materials to happen, but that raises the house cost. So we need to make sure that we're watching for that. And one of the things that's out there right now is just requiring solar access. Well, maybe if we require solar access, that potentially has the effect of reducing the height of buildings. And if you can't build up, you have to go out. So always think about those unintended consequences. There's no one silver bullet that's gonna help us. And again, we've got multiple priorities, and we need to seek the balance of all those priorities. Make sure that you're keeping a wide purview of what you're looking at.